Hello. It's great to be part of this conversation. Our global brands truly committed to authentic African representation. It's a powerful question and frankly, an important one. The reality is brands don't really have a choice anymore. Representation is no longer optional because inclusion is no longer nice to have. It's one of the most powerful drivers of growth we have today. And the data is very clear. Including advertising drives 3.5% short-term sales. I'll just give you 4 data points here. 3.5 short-term sales, 16% long-term sales growth, and it delivers 62% higher likelihood of being first choice as a brand and 15% stronger loyalty. So let's be clear, global brands have to learn to show representation, and then they are increasingly showing representation because inclusion equals growth. Now, the African representation we're seeing, is it representation for the sake of representation? Are global brands representing Africa because they have to? Or is it truly building meaning, trust, and value with Africa? Is it true commitment? Is it authentic? And I think part of the challenge that we have to address today is in that very word, authentic, because authenticity is not about what you say. It is really about what people experience, how they live it. So the truth is, representation only creates value when it feels real, when it builds trust, when it is meaningful. And that still is where the gap sits, in my view. So let me make it real. If you look at one of Africa's most advanced advertising markets, that's South Africa, on the surface, more diversity, more representation. When you go deeper, the picture changes drastically, right? Portrayals are flattening, so positive portrayals of women are declining. Roles are not evolving. We still see roughly 5% of ads that show people in non-traditional roles, and entire groups are still invisible. So yes, global brands are getting better at showing diversity, representation, but not necessarily at delivering inclusion. And I think that is that still is the huge gap in delivery of that representation, which is really the challenge. So, and this matters, right? Because we know from the data that inclusive experiences make brands more meaningful and more different, the very two drivers of growth, right? So if representation, inclusion doesn't feel authentic, well, it doesn't build meaning. And if it doesn't build meaning, it doesn't deliver the growth that the data promises. So I think in answering this question, are global brands committed to representation? We also need to ask, are they committed to the kind of representation that builds trust? Representation that comes from a place of respect, that's meaningful to African consumers. Because in fact, I recall this stat, right? 72% of consumers worry that brands are involved in these conversations around representation just for commercial reasons, right? So that's why we need to think about it in that way, right? Because Africa is not just a market to be represented, if you ask me. It is the continent shaping the future of growth, culture, and demand. And the brands that will win in the continent are not the ones that necessarily just show Africa. It's the ones that build with Africa. Brand growth in Africa comes from the progress that you build, not the promises that you make or the representation that you show. So representation is what brands say. Progress is really, what people feel, and it comes from the kind of representation and inclusion that build trust and create value. So I'll end here. I think as we go into this debate, I'd love us to think about like three questions, right? Three questions to challenge how we define authenticity today. One is representation enough, right? If it doesn't challenge stereotypes or shift power, really. Second, in a continent that represents the future of growth, what is the real cost of getting authenticity wrong? And third, if inclusion is proven to drive growth, why are we not seeing consistent progress, right? Why is progress still very uneven and inconsistent? Because in the end, authenticity is what connects representation to inclusion and inclusion to growth. When we do get this right, we don't just create better marketing. We actually unlock real value for people, for brands, and for the future of this beautiful continent of ours.